I had slept on stone warmed by dying suns, on alloy decks humming with radiation, and once inside the ribbed hull of a wrecked cruiser where the stars themselves felt cold. But I had never slept in a human bed until a human invited me into his. Kaylee's rested her clawed fingertips against the inner bulkhead of the freight vessel Wayfarer's Mercy and let the chill bleed into her skin, a familiar ache that reminded her she was far from home. The ship's environmental systems were tuned to human norms, a steady 21 degrees that left her shivering no matter how many cycles passed. She was born beneath the copper skies of Vierk's Prime, where the heat never truly faded and the ground itself pulsed with warmth, and her people had evolved to drink that heat into their blood. Here, among the stars of human space, she was always cold. 3 years aboard the Mercy had taught her endurance if nothing else. She was the only Threxian on the crew, hired muscle and occasional navigator, tolerated for her usefulness and little more. Her assigned quarters had once been a supply locker, narrow and uninsulated, with a flickering heat coil that worked when it felt like it. Most nights she slept wrapped in a thermal sheet, tail curled tight, breathing slow so she would not waste energy fighting the cold. That night was worse than usual. The coil had failed again, and the metal walls felt like ice. She was considering another sleepless cycle when footsteps echoed down the cargo bay, and she turned to see Elias Rowan approaching, dark hair tousled, sleeves rolled up, holding a mug that steamed in the frigid air. He noticed her posture immediately, the way her shoulders were drawn inward, the faint color shift along her scales that marked discomfort. Humans were strange that way, fragile-looking yet remarkably perceptive when they chose to be. "Cold again?" he asked, voice gentle, as if volume alone might bruise her. Her translator rendered her reply smoothly, though her native tongue rasped beneath it. "This vessel is preserved like a corpse. Your people prefer the temperature of tombs." He smiled faintly at that, then frowned as his gaze dropped to the faint shimmer of frost along the floor near her feet. "Your heater's out, isn't it?" It wasn't really a question. She hesitated, then inclined her head. The captain had made his priorities clear long ago. Cargo came first, engines second, crew comfort a distant third, and non-human comfort barely registered at all. Elias exhaled through his nose, irritation flashing across his features. "That's unacceptable," he muttered. "You shouldn't be freezing every night." "I am accustomed," Kaylee's replied, though the words felt thin even to her. "My people are not delicate." He looked at her then, really looked, not as hired claws or an alien curiosity, but as someone he cared about. "No one should have to get used to being miserable," he said. There was a pause, just long enough for her to sense hesitation, then he cleared his throat. "My quarters are warm. The climate unit actually works. You could stay there tonight, just tonight." The words landed between them, heavy and unexpected. Among the Threxian, personal space was sacred, intimacy carefully rationed, and among humans she had learned to expect distance, caution, sometimes fear. An invitation like that carried weight she wasn't sure how to hold. "I would be an intrusion," she said quietly. "Humans guard their sleeping places." Elias shrugged, trying for casual and failing slightly. "I guard my friends more." He gestured down the corridor. "Come on. Before you freeze solid, and I have to explain to the captain why his best navigator turned into a statue." She followed him in silence, heart thrumming in her chest in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. His quarters were small but clean, the air warm enough that she felt it immediately, heat seeping into her muscles until she had to fight the urge to sag with relief. The room smelled faintly of metal, and something human she couldn't name, comforting and unfamiliar all at once. Elias showed her the climate controls, told her to set them however she needed, then unrolled a sleeping mat on the floor with thick blankets clearly rated for extremes. She watched him, then looked at the raised bunk along the wall, piled with quilts and pillows that radiated warmth even from a distance. "I have never rested in something like that," she admitted. "On Vierk's, we sleep on sun-warmed stone. Soft surfaces are rare." He glanced at the bed, then back at her, something softening in his eyes. "You take it," he said suddenly. She stared. "No, yes." He was already stripping the blankets, tossing them onto the floor mat. "I'll be fine down here." "You need it more than I do." She hesitated, torn between instinct and exhaustion, then stepped closer to the bed, laying a hand on the fabric as if it might vanish. "Why?" she asked. "Our peoples have hunted each other across half a sector. I am not harmless." Elias met her gaze steadily. "You're Kaylee's," he said. "That's all I see." The bed was warmer than she had imagined, cradling her body instead of leaching heat from it, the blankets heavy and reassuring, smelling faintly of him. As she lay there, warmth wrapped around her not just in flesh but somewhere deeper, a loosening she hadn't realized she carried. She felt safe, valued. When she spoke again, her voice was soft. "Among my people, we say heat shared is survival multiplied." There was a quiet smile in his voice when he answered. "Then I'm glad to share." As sleep finally took her, Kaylee's realized that across countless systems and a lifetime of wandering, it wasn't credits or contracts that anchored a soul. But moments like this, offered freely, no price demanded. In the quiet hum of the wayfarer's mercy, in a human bed that welcomed her without question, she felt something settle into place, fragile and fierce and unmistakably new. And she knew that when morning came, the cold would no longer feel quite so endless, because she would not be facing it alone. Morning came quietly, the way it always did in deep transit. Marked not by sunrise, but by a subtle shift in the ship's hum and the soft glow of artificial light along the bulkheads. Kaylee's woke slowly, disoriented by warmth that still surrounded her, by fabric beneath her instead of metal, by the strange, steady rhythm of another being breathing nearby. For a long moment she remained still, afraid that if she moved the comfort would shatter like heat mirages on Vyerk's prime. Her muscles felt loose, supple, her scales holding a richer sheen than they had in months, color deepened by rest she had not known she was missing. She turned her head and saw Elias on the floor mat, one arm flung over his eyes, blankets half tangled around long legs, utterly unguarded in sleep. The sight stirred something unfamiliar and unsettling in her chest. Among her people, sleep was vulnerability, shared only with bonded kin, yet here he was, trusting her without hesitation. She rose quietly, intending to retreat before he woke, but the bed seemed reluctant to let her go, warmth clinging to her like memory. As she sat up, the blankets slipped, and with them a low sound escaped her throat, a soft, involuntary trill of contentment she had not voiced since childhood. Elias stirred at the sound, blinking awake, eyes focusing on her with a sleep-rough smile that made her breath catch. "You're alive," he murmured. "Good sign." She tilted her head, embarrassed by the sudden flush of color along her neck ridges. "I fear you have ruined me," she said. "Stone will never suffice again." He laughed quietly, sitting up, rubbing a hand through his hair. "I'll take that as a compliment." He glanced at the bed, then back at her, something gentler in his gaze. "Did you sleep?" "I rested," she corrected, then paused. "No. I slept." The word felt important. Something shifted between them after that, a subtle recalibration neither spoke aloud. Over the following days, repairs to her heater were promised and delayed in equal measure. Excuses stacking like cargo manifests, and Elias' quarters became an unspoken refuge. At first it was only for sleep, nothing more than shared space and shared silence, but silence has a way of growing intimate when it repeats itself. They talked in low voices after the ship settled for the night, about Vyerk's twin sons and the way the heat sang against stone. About Elias' childhood on a water world where storms rolled in without warning and the sea smelled like metal and rain. She told him of her people's rites of adulthood, of scars earned beneath open skies, and he listened without flinching, without judgment. He spoke of human loneliness among the stars, of how vast space made even crowded ships feel hollow. One night, as the ship drifted between systems, the climate control flickered and the room cooled suddenly, and without thinking he reached for her, hand resting lightly against her arm. She froze at first, instincts flaring, then felt the warmth of him, steady and real, and did not pull away. Touch became language after that, tentative at first, fingers brushing scales, her tail curling unconsciously closer as if drawn by gravity. He learned where her skin was most sensitive to temperature, how certain ridges flushed when she was overwhelmed, and she learned the subtle changes in his breathing. The way his pulse jumped beneath her palm when she leaned too close. The crew noticed, of course. Whispers followed them through corridors, glances lingered, but no one challenged it outright, perhaps sensing that whatever had formed between them was not easily broken. One cycle, turbulence jolted the ship mid-transit, throwing Kaylee's off balance, and Elias caught her without hesitation, arms tight around her, anchoring her against him. For a heartbeat, neither moved. She could feel his heart racing, feel the warmth of him pressed against her core, and something inside her shifted irrevocably. "On my world," she said softly later, voice rough with emotion, "to share warmth is to share life." He met her gaze, eyes serious now, no trace of humor. "Then I'm not letting go," he replied. When they finally shared the bed together, it was not sudden or reckless, but inevitable, the culmination of nights spent orbiting one another. He asked permission with his eyes, with the stillness of his body, and she gave it by leaning into him, by letting her forehead rest against his chest, listening to the sound of him, alive beneath her ear. The bed held them both, warmth layered upon warmth, and for the first time since leaving Vierk's Prime, Kaylee's did not feel like a visitor passing through human space. She felt chosen. She felt anchored. In the vast indifference of the galaxy, amid cold metal and distant stars, two beings from worlds that should never have touched found something fiercely fragile and enduring. A shared heat that promised not just survival, but a future worth reaching for together. They did not speak of what they were becoming, not at first, as if naming it might make it fragile, but the ship itself seemed to notice the change. The Wayfarer's mercy carried them onward through long stretches of quiet space, stars sliding past the viewports like distant embers. And within that steady motion, their closeness settled into something natural, something that did not need explanation. Kaylee's found herself lingering near Elias even during duty hours, her senses attuned to his presence, the faint heat he radiated cutting through the chill that had once been her constant companion. He, in turn, began to time his shifts around hers, engineering tasks conveniently aligning with navigation checks, excuses thin but sincere. At night they shared the bed, not always touching, sometimes simply existing side by side, learning the comfort of another body nearby, learning that intimacy did not demand urgency. There were nights when she woke from dreams of Vierk's Prime, heat-blasted stone and roaring skies, and found herself pressed against him, his arm instinctively drawn around her, grounding her in the present. In those moments, she realized that warmth could be remembered, that it could linger even when the suns were gone. He learned the cadence of her breathing when she slept, the way her tail shifted when she dreamed deeply, and she learned the small sounds he made unconsciously, the faint hum in his throat when he was content. One cycle, as the ship drifted through a region of unstable space, alarms flaring briefly before settling, fear surged through the crew, sharp and electric. Kaylee's felt it too, a primal tightening in her chest, memories of battles long past stirring beneath her scales, and without thinking she reached for Elias, gripping his hand with a strength that surprised him. He squeezed back just as firmly, anchoring her, and in that shared tension she understood something fundamental. This was what her people meant by bond, by chosen kin. Not blood, not origin, but the decision to stand together when the void pressed close. Later, when the ship was quiet again, she spoke of it, haltingly, words heavy with cultural weight. She told him that among the Threxian, to choose warmth over solitude was an act of courage. That bonds formed away from one's homeworld were considered the strongest, because they were made without obligation. Elias listened, eyes never leaving her, and when she finished, he rested his forehead against hers, careful, reverent. "Then I choose you," he said simply. The words settled into her like a second heart, steady and sure. From that moment, the cold no longer felt like an enemy but a contrast, something that made their shared heat more meaningful. She began to imagine a future beyond the mercy, beyond contracts and temporary ports, a place where warmth was not borrowed but built together. He spoke of leaving the merchant lanes someday, of finding a quieter route, a life less dictated by manifests and margins, and when he spoke, his eyes always flicked to her, as if checking whether she might see herself there too. She did, in the vastness of space, where most lives brushed past one another and vanished. They had found something improbably enduring, a connection that defied history and expectation. Kaylee's knew there would be challenges, suspicion from both their peoples, moments when the galaxy would remind them how different they were, but as she lay beside him, wrapped in warmth that was no longer just physical, she understood that some risks were worth taking. The stars outside burned cold and distant, but within the small gravity of that shared bed, within the quiet trust they had built breath by breath, she had found not just comfort, but belonging. And for the first time since leaving her sun-scorched world, the future felt less like an endless void and more like a path she was ready to walk, hand in hand, into whatever light awaited them. The danger came without warning, the way it always did in the deep lanes. Announced not by drama, but by a sudden shudder that rippled through the wayfarer's mercy like a struck nerve. Kaylee's felt it instantly, every survival instinct flaring hot beneath her scales as the lights dimmed, and the ship's hum dropped into an uneven, wounded cadence. Alarms followed a breath later, sharp and insistent, and the calm she had learned beside Elia's fractured into motion. She was on her feet before the first warning finished sounding, already reaching for the blade she kept magnetized at her thigh, her body remembering battles her mind had long buried. Elia's was moving too, boots hitting the deck hard as he pulled on his jacket, eyes already calculating. "Boarding spike," he said grimly as the tactical display flickered to life. "Unregistered." Fast, raiders then, the kind that prowled the fringe routes, drawn by merchant hulls heavy with cargo and light on escorts. The crew scattered to stations, fear thick in the air, and Kaylee's felt the old clarity settle over her, the cold focus she had once believed defined her entire existence. Only now, threaded through it, was something new and dangerous, the fear of losing him. The first impact rocked the ship, metal screaming as clamps bit into the hull, and Kaylee's did not wait for orders. She met Elia's gaze, a silent exchange of trust passing between them, then turned toward the cargo corridors where borders would breach. The first pirate came through the smoke fast and reckless, pulse rifle raised, and Kaylee's took him down in a blur of motion, blade flashing, scales darkening as adrenaline surged. She moved like heat given form, every strike precise, every step controlled, fighting not for credits or contracts, but for the fragile life she had begun to build. The corridors filled with chaos, weapons fire lighting the shadows, bodies hitting the deck. And through it all she kept track of Elia's by sound and instinct, the crack of his tool-turned weapon, the sharp commands he barked to panicking crew. When a blast caught him off guard, throwing him hard against the bulkhead, something inside her snapped. She was there in an instant, interposing herself between him and the next attacker, taking the hit meant for him across her armored shoulder, pain flaring white-hot. She did not fall. She could not. The fight ended as abruptly as it began, raiders repelled, their spike jettisoned into the void, the Mercy limping but alive. In the aftermath, as emergency lights bathed the ship in red and the crew accounted for their wounded, Kaylee's found herself shaking. The delayed echo of fear, crashing through her now that the danger had passed. Elia's reached her then, hands gentle but firm, checking her injury, his voice unsteady despite his efforts. "You took that hit for me," he said. She met his eyes, seeing her own fear reflected there, raw and unguarded. "On my world," she replied softly, "to shield another with your body is a vow." He pulled her into him without hesitation, arms tight, heedless of who might see. And she let herself lean into his warmth, grounding herself in the steady reality of him alive against her. In that embrace, amid scorched metal and drifting debris, she understood that love was not just shared comfort or quiet nights, but the willingness to stand between someone and the dark. To choose them even when the stars turned hostile. The galaxy had tested them and would do so again, she knew, but as the Mercy steadied and the crew began repairs, Kaylee's felt something unbreakable settle between her and Elia's. Forged not in warmth alone, but in fire and whatever waited for them beyond the next jump point, she would face it with blade ready and heart fully claimed. In the hours that followed, the ship moved in a fragile quiet, the kind that came after violence, when every sound felt too loud and every shadow hinted at unfinished danger. Emergency crews sealed ruptures and rerouted power, and the Wayfarer's Mercy limped onward through the dark, engines running hot and uneven. Kaylee's sat on the edge of Elias' bunk while he worked on the gash across her shoulder, his hands steady despite the tension that still lived in his jaw. The wound was already sealing, her biology knitting heat and flesh together, but his touch lingered, careful, reverent, as if he were afraid she might fade if he let go. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "I know," she replied, meeting his eyes. "I chose to." The weight of that choice settled between them, heavier than any spoken promise. Outside the thin walls of the quarters, crew members whispered about the attack, about how close they had come to losing the ship, about the Threxian, who fought like a living weapon, and the human engineer who stood his ground beside her. Kaylee's felt their gazes when she passed later, a mixture of awe and unease, and for the first time she did not flinch from it. She had been feared before. What was new was knowing someone would stand with her regardless. That night, sleep did not come easily. Every vibration of the hull sent her instincts flaring, every flicker of light dragging her halfway back into the corridor filled with smoke and fire. Elias felt it before she spoke, drawing her closer, one hand resting over her core, warmth steady and grounding. "We're safe," he murmured, though they both knew safety was a temporary state among the stars. She curled into him, tail wrapping loosely around his legs, and let herself breathe him in, the familiar scent anchoring her in the present. "My people believe danger reveals truth," she said after a long silence. "In battle, we learn who we are willing to die for." He tightened his hold just slightly. "And what did you learn?" She did not answer with words. Instead, she lifted her head and pressed her brow to his, a Threxian gesture of trust rarely offered outside deep bond. He closed his eyes, accepting it without hesitation, and in that quiet exchange, something sealed between them, unspoken and unbreakable. The days that followed were tense, every jump point shadowed by the possibility of pursuit, but the raiders did not return. Instead, news filtered in through fractured comms of increased pirate activity along the route, of merchant ships vanishing without trace. The captain pushed the crew hard, cutting rest cycles, rerouting through less charted space, and Kaylee's felt the familiar pull of the hunt stirring beneath her skin. She offered her skills without reservation now, advising on defensive maneuvers, standing watch for hours without complaint, and Elias backed her every time, his quiet authority lending weight to her words. Together, they became a constant, a paired presence the crew learned to rely on, even if they did not fully understand it. One cycle, as the ship skimmed the edge of a dead system, littered with wreckage, long-range sensors picked up a shadow trailing them, faint but persistent. Suspense coiled tight through the Mercy as power was diverted, weapons primed, escape vectors plotted. Kaylee stood beside Elias on the bridge, every sense attuned to the void beyond the hull, ready for the inevitable clash. But the shadow never struck. It lingered, then fell away, as if reconsidering, as if deciding this prey was no longer easy. When the tension finally eased, she realized her hands were clenched around his, fingers interlaced so tightly they ached. He didn't pull away. Later, alone again, she admitted the fear she had carried since the boarding, the terror of losing him to a galaxy that cared nothing for what they had found. He listened, then cupped her face in his hands, thumbs warm against her scales. "I don't know how this ends," he said honestly. "But I know I'm not walking away." The future remained uncertain, threaded with danger and difference, but as Kaylee's lay beside him, the ship humming steadily around them, she felt something stronger than fear take root. Whatever threats waited beyond the next star, whatever battles the void demanded, she would meet them not as a lone wanderer hardened by cold, but as someone bound by choice and shared heat, ready to fight not just to survive, but to protect the fragile, luminous thing they had built together in the dark. The next attack came quieter, more deliberate, the kind that announced intelligence rather than desperation. Kaylee sensed it before the alarms, a subtle wrongness in the ship's rhythm, a hesitation in the engines that spoke of external interference. Elias felt it too, fingers pausing mid-adjustment as his eyes flicked to the diagnostics. "They're back," he said under his breath. This time there was no violent impact, no tearing scream of metal, only the creeping realization that something was already inside their systems, threading through the Mercy like a parasite. Power fluctuations rippled outward, lights dimming, gravity stuttering just enough to unsettle balance, and the captain's voice snapped over comms, tight with strain. "We've got a breach in the network. Not physical, someone's riding us." A hunter then, not a raider, a crew patient enough to stalk rather than strike. Kaylee's felt her pulse quicken, instincts sharpening, and she moved closer to Elia's without thinking, shoulder brushing his arm, a silent promise of proximity in the face of the unknown. He routed commands with frantic precision, sweat beading at his temples as he fought an invisible enemy that anticipated every move. "They're probing for weaknesses," he muttered. "Looking for leverage." The word sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with temperature. She knew her kind's reputation, knew what a clever enemy might try. She opened a channel to the captain, voice steady. "They will not outfight us. They will try to frighten us." As if summoned by her words, the ship lurched again, harder this time, and a distorted signal bled through the comms, a voice warped by distance and intent. They named her species, named her past, dredged up old wars and old blood, promised safety in exchange for surrender. The crew stiffened, fear turning toward her like a spotlight, and for a heartbeat, she felt the old isolation threaten to swallow her whole. Then Elias stepped forward, cutting the channel with a sharp command, his voice carrying across the bridge. "She's not a bargaining chip," he said. "She's crew." The simplicity of it struck harder than any weapon. Kaylee's drew a slow breath, heat building in her core, and moved to the auxiliary controls. "If they want fear," she said quietly, "we will give them resistance." Together they executed a risky maneuver, dumping false power signatures and rerouting heat through the hull, masking their true vector and turning the Mercy into a ghost amid drifting wreckage. The shadow reappeared on sensors, closing fast, confident now, and Kaylee's felt the familiar calm settle over her as combat loomed. When the enemy finally committed, slipping too close, she triggered the countermeasure, a pulse of redirected energy that lit the void and sent the pursuing craft spiraling away. Crippled but not destroyed. Silence followed, thick and absolute. No cheers came this time, only relief, hard-earned and shaky. Later, in the quiet of their quarters, Kaylee's felt the aftermath crash through her, the echo of that broadcast tearing at old scars she thought long healed. Elias found her there, sitting on the edge of the bed, scales dulled, gaze distant. He knelt in front of her without a word, resting his forehead against her knee, grounding them both. "They don't get to define you," he said softly. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of him seep into places the cold had touched long before they met. "You stood for me," she said. "Against your own kind." He looked up then, eyes fierce and tender all at once. "Against anyone." She pulled him up beside her, holding him with a strength that trembled, not from fear, but from the enormity of what they were choosing. The galaxy had tested them with fire and shadow, with blades and whispers, and each time they had answered together. As the Wayfarer's Mercy resumed her course, engines steady once more, Kaylee's understood that danger would never fully leave them. That love forged in the void demanded vigilance as much as devotion. But lying there, entwined, warmth shared and promises unspoken yet deeply felt, she knew that whatever darkness lay ahead, they would face it side by side, not as wanderer and engineer. Not as alien and human, but as two lives irrevocably bound, daring the cold universe to try and tear them apart. The ship carried the scars of the encounter with it. Subtle tremors in the hull and a lingering smell of scorched circuitry that no amount of ventilation quite erased. And in those days after the second attack, the crew moved with a heightened awareness. Voices lower, tempers shorter, every unexpected sound a potential threat. Kaylee's felt it in her bones, the way the void seemed to press closer, as if offended that its prey had slipped free again. She remained close to Elias whenever duty allowed, not out of fear alone, but out of a growing certainty that whatever came next would test them harder than before. The enemy had learned her name, her history, and that knowledge gnawed at her in quiet moments, dredging up memories of battlefields washed in heat and blood, of choices made for survival rather than mercy. Elias noticed the change in her before she spoke of it, the way her movements grew sharper, more economical, her humor fading into something watchful and restrained. One night, as the Mercy drifted between jumps, He found her in the observation corridor staring out at the stars, their cold light reflected across her scales. "You're carrying this alone," he said gently. She did not turn at first. "If they come again," she replied, voice low, "they will not seek the ship. They will seek me." He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel his warmth without touching. "Then they'll have to go through us," he said, simple and absolute. She finally looked at him then, something raw breaking through her composure. "My people are taught that attachment is weakness," she said. "That to care is to offer an enemy a blade." "Maybe," he answered quietly, "or maybe it's how you find something worth defending." The words stayed with her when the attack finally came. Not as a sudden strike, but as a trap sprung at the worst possible moment, mid-jump, systems screaming as space folded wrong around them. The Mercy was thrown violently back into real space, alarms blaring, stars snapping into focus far too close, and before the crew could recover, hostile signatures bloomed across the sensors. 3 ships this time, sleek and predatory. There would be no running. Kaylee's felt the old fire surge through her, every instinct screaming for motion, for violence, and she welcomed it, because this time she knew exactly what she was fighting for. She took command of the defense teams with ruthless clarity, voice cutting through panic, placing crew where they could do the most good, turning fear into action. Elias stayed on the bridge, hands flying, coaxing power from wounded systems, his voice a constant presence in her ear as they coordinated through the chaos. Borders breached again, smarter this time. Flanking, probing, and Kaylee's met them head-on, blade singing, body moving with lethal grace through smoke and flashing light. Each strike was precise, each movement fueled not by rage but by resolve. When one of them tried to take her alive, reaching for restraints instead of a weapon, she understood the depth of their intent and responded with ferocity that left no doubt. The fighting bled through corridors and cargo holds, the Mercy groaning under the strain, and in the heart of it all Kaylee's felt Elias falter. Heard the hitch in his voice as a power conduit exploded near the bridge. Fear slammed into her harder than any blow. She cut her way through the last of the borders with brutal efficiency and ran, ignoring pain, ignoring protocol, following the sound of him. She found him conscious but bleeding, slumped against a console, smoke curling around them, and something in her chest broke open at the sight. She dropped to her knees beside him, hands shaking as she checked his injuries, heat flooding her limbs as if her body itself demanded he survive. "Stay with me," she said, the words torn from her, ancient and desperate. He smiled faintly even then. Wasn't planning on leaving. Together, they held the line until the crew forced the attackers back, until the enemy ships broke away at last. Retreating into the dark, with whatever conclusion they had drawn about the cost of pursuing them further. When it was over, truly over, Kaylee's remained beside Elias long after medics cleared him, long after the ship stabilized, her grip on his hand unyielding. In that quiet aftermath, surrounded by wreckage and survival, she understood that attachment was not a weakness but a transformation, that caring did not dull her edge but sharpened it, giving her a reason to endure beyond instinct. As the Wayfarer's Mercy limped onward once more, battered but alive, Kaylee's lay beside Elias in the warmth they had claimed together, the stars cold and distant beyond the hull, and knew that whatever the galaxy demanded next, they would meet it not as isolated survivors, but as something far rarer and far more dangerous to those who threatened them. 2 lives bound by choice, by shared fire, and by a love strong enough to defy the void itself. The decision was not dramatic when it finally came, no grand declaration or shouted rebellion. Just a quiet understanding that settled between them as the Wayfarer's Mercy drifted toward the next trade hub, and the long shadow of pursuit loomed behind every charted route. Kaylee stood beside Elias in his quarters, the bed warm beneath their hands, the hum of the ship steady but tired. And she knew with sudden certainty that staying meant waiting for the galaxy to try again. Her enemies would not forget her, and the price of remaining visible would eventually be paid in blood, perhaps not hers, but his. Elias saw the truth in her eyes before she spoke, the same truth that had been building in him since the first boarding Spike tore into the hull. "We can vanish," he said quietly. "There are places beyond the lanes." Worlds no one bothers to catalog because there's nothing to take. The thought should have frightened her, abandoning contracts and reputation, stepping away from the only life she had known for years, but instead it felt like warmth spreading through her core. To disappear together was not retreat, it was choice. They told no one except the captain, and even that conversation was brief, heavy with unspoken gratitude and relief. When the Mercy docked, Kaylee's left her blade behind, magnetized to the bulkhead where it had hung for so long, a symbol of a life she no longer needed to carry forward. Elias rerouted a small survey shuttle, wiped its registry clean, and loaded it with enough supplies to vanish without a trace. As they slipped away from the station under borrowed clearance codes, Kaylee's watched the familiar lights recede and felt no regret, only a quiet, fierce anticipation. The jump took them far beyond the fringe, through unstable currents and unclaimed space, until the stars themselves seemed fewer, older, colder. They emerged above a planet with wide amber seas and slow-moving clouds, its surface warmed by a single generous sun, unremarkable by any trading metric, and therefore perfect. The air was breathable, the land fertile enough, the heat gentle but constant, and when Kaylee stepped onto the soil for the first time, she felt it rise through her feet and into her bones. A homecoming she had not expected to feel so far from Vyerk's prime. They built their life slowly, clumsily, with laughter and frustration in equal measure. A shelter first, then a dwelling, then something that began to feel like permanence. Elias learned the rhythms of the land, the way storms gathered without warning, and Kaylee's taught him how to read heat in stone and soil, how to listen to a world instead of trying to bend it. Nights were warm, shared beneath unfamiliar stars, the bed they fashioned together softer than stone but grounded in earth, their bodies fitting with the ease of something long destined. The danger faded into memory, not forgotten but no longer sharp, and in its place grew quiet moments of belonging, of shared work and shared rest, of choosing each other every day without fear of who might be watching. In the end, it was not the galaxy they escaped, but the cold it had pressed into their lives. On that distant, nameless planet, far from war and pursuit, Kaylee's and Elias became something the void could no longer touch. Two lives entwined not by survival alone, but by love freely chosen. Warm and enduring, a small, defiant light burning steadily at the edge of the stars.